Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Ron Terrell, to discuss social media and how it's impacted our understanding of the pandemic. Dr. Terrell, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So your PhD is in information studies from University of Toronto, and you teach communication at Purdue University Northwest. You're an assistant professor there. How is your view of the pandemic different from what everybody else is seeing? What are you tracking here when you're observing this?
Okay, well, I'm not so sure whether or not my perspective is different than anyone else's. However, the way I'm looking at it through social media, I guess, is with a more critical view and hopefully trying to use a little bit of media literacy in parsing out, the truths from the non-truths about the pandemic itself.
Yeah. Well, can we go through this somewhat chronologically here?
Sure.
Because it seems to me that social media was very involved in our first becoming aware of the threat here, right? Can you walk us through some of that?
Yeah, I mean, when it first, occurred or happened, it was already on social media about things happening in other parts of the world,
right.
Whereas it wasn't necessarily understood and or being reported on, by mainstream media, let's say, but certainly not being acknowledged by those people in positions of power at the time, right?
Yeah.
They thought, they didn't think anything of it because nobody really knew.
Well, in communication studies, we talk about the integrity of the sender and the integrity of the channel that something
Right.
goes through, right? And how that impacts the believability of the message.
Sure.
So since most people found out about the virus through social media, do you think that caused them to discount it a little bit as a threat?
I think that depending on one's understanding and depending on one's media literacy, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, if somebody who's a non-believer, read something that discounted the virus, obviously they were going to adhere to that belief, and right?
Yes, but I mean even before that, though. I mean, the fact that we first heard about it through social media, it kind of sounded like it was a rumor or a hoax.
Right.
Didn't it? I mean, wasn't that one of the first reactions?
Sure, but again, depending on who you're listening to, I would say, right?
Yeah.
So if the message was from a virologist who's doing this study
Yeah.
on the pandemic or on this new thing that's happening, which could possibly and did turn out to be a pandemic, and you knew and you understand how virologists work,
Yeah.
then you would believe that.
Well, of
right?
course.
Whereas,
Yeah.
but some people who again try to or do remain in their echo chambers, regardless of who's saying what, because they heard something from another source, is still not going to believe it. And I think that's a large part of what is happening in society today. Like, non-believers have heard that this thing is a hoax from the president himself, so therefore it will always be a hoax, regardless of evidence that's presented to them.
Wasn't there a point at which, though, the information that we initially had on this sounded, to most people even, right? It sounded a little, inflammatory, right? And then then we started hearing from people who were actually legitimately investigating this, and they were saying, you know what, this is really more serious than we think it is, right? So it seems to me right from the beginning there was a bit of a tug of war going on, right, between the people who broke the news through social media, essentially, right?
Sure.
And the experts who really knew more about it, who were playing catch-up, actually, right?
Right. I think that, so personally speaking, I think that I was in a bit of a different situation in that I have friends who are in health studies and
Yeah.
who have spoken to, and we've discussed the possibilities of this type of thing happening. And so, with that understanding in mind, it's not difficult then to think that this is happening right now. Whereas other people, again, there's still a lot of people who believe it's nothing more than or not stronger than the flu, right? I've read stories on social media where nurses have said that people, even as they're being intubated, are still in disbelief that this COVID thing is real.
Yeah.
So how do you contrast that with reality? I mean, you're being intubated and you're still denying the fact that this is happening.
So here's another way to look at it. I mean, if there were no social media, how do you think we'd be responding to this differently?
If there was no social media, then we would be relying on the news.
So it would have been announced. Would have been announced by a health care expert or official,
exactly,
through the news media, right? There would have been less debate about it. There would still be some debate, right?
Sure. But again, the president of the United States said, from the beginning that they didn't take it as serious as it was.
Right.
So
and he said it through social media.
Right. And so if the most powerful person, let's say, in the country tells you that they don't think it's that big a deal, then a lot of people will adhere to that belief. Right?
So you think Trump's the bigger influencer here?
Well, yeah,
it is
he does.
The bully pulpit, as Roosevelt said.
He does have a lot of influence on a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
it went from, again, it's a hoax and disbelieving it to taking it more seriously, and some people actually, one of his handlers or his promoters, who he got rid of before, said that was the primary reason why he lost the election, is because of the way he handled the pandemic, in that he didn't handle it well at all. And because of the reports of people who have died from the pandemic, and lack of response from the government, and a lack of help and support, certainly didn't help his cause.
Yeah. So in the old days, when we were mainly reliant on newspapers and television news broadcasts, if the president or someone representing the president said something that was misinformation, essentially, that would have been challenged. The reporters would have gone out and interviewed experts with other opinions, and there would have been editorials, perhaps, demanding the person's resignation. How is that different now because of social media?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that we can get back to that point.
Well, before we speculate on that, I mean, how's it different?
Well,
I mean, does social media amplify misinformation?
Absolutely, absolutely it does. And again, this is where media literacy comes in, because we have social media allows for people to create stories. So when Trump talks about, he blames mainstream media as creating fake news. I mean, people out there are creating fake news all the time, right? Then that's being, it's easy enough to create a meme and put a tag under it and push it out on social media, and people will just, some people will just look at it and blindly take it as being fact and amplify whatever that story is, right? So one of the things recently, and my friend actually mentioned it to me, and again, because they were talking about the effectiveness of masks, okay? And his daughter said, well, she saw on TikTok that, masks weren't effective, and not only that, they were dangerous because of the carbon dioxide buildup and all these, nonsensical things. But it was it's being accepted as truth and fact by a lot of people, and perhaps a lot of younger people. So I saw a tweet where, and I think one of the ways to combat that is to have the experts respond to it on social media and say, this is not, what you're saying is incorrect, and these are the actual facts. And when they're challenged, then they can state their expertise, why they have expertise in the subject. And I love those tweets where, a person does challenge them and say, like, how do you know what you're talking about? And it's like, well, I have an expert in blah, blah, I have a PhD in this, and, in all these things, and therefore, I know what I'm talking about. What's your expertise in?
Yeah, right.
Right? So it turns it around. And I think that is, although it's a little bit snarky, I mean, I think it's really effective.
It's an important point.
Right. And shutting down all these, nonsensical things that are being spread.
Yeah.
And dangerously, I might add.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess when you think about democracy and public debate, there are most issues, I would guess, are issues where we can all voice our opinions on them, and we all have an equal, should we go to war or not? Should we spend more money on, on defense, things like that? But we want to hear from experts when we do that, right? We want to be informed.
Absolutely. I mean, there's
a role for both, right?
Right. I mean, everybody has an opinion. Can have an opinion on something. Everybody has, the right to speak out and voice their opinion. However, there's a reason why we have experts and people gain expertise on these things, because. So an example I use all the time is, would you be willing to, to undergo surgery from somebody who learned from YouTube, right?
Right.
Because that's similar to.
Or was in medical school during the pandemic and was studying online.
Right.
Maybe?
Or somebody who's had 1 year of training.
Yeah.
It takes 6 years.
Right.
Of,
well, what about taking
residence.
your car to somebody, right?
Right.
Have them work on your engine.
Sure. Yeah. Because again, it's certainly there on YouTube, and you have that information, whether or not it's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I've hired a few carpenters over the years to work on my house who weren't as trained as they told me they were.
Right.
I wanted to get at the objectivity issue for a minute here.
Okay.
And I know, to get this started, when I was in journalism school years ago, they told us early on, it's impossible to be objective. It's, all human expression is subjective by nature. And then they assigned us beats and told us to go out and report the news, and that we better be objective when we reported it, right? It's always been this paradoxical situation that the news media has been in, where we value what they give us because they're attempting to be objective.
Right.
But we know that no one's absolutely capable of being objective, right? So is the issue here then not that social media isn't objective and traditional journalists are, but the traditional journalists are trying to be more objective, and that there's a structure there, and there's a process there that keeps that on target, and that there's no governing process outside of that sphere? Or is that being elitist? What do you think?
Okay, so first of all, standard journalism etiquette states that you should try to be as a
cover both sides of the story, leave your opinion out,
non-biased, and doing that. However, certainly the bias is inherent, and it's going to be there in one form or another. In drawing from one explicit example is Fox News, where they don't hide their bias. It's there, and they push that bias.
I said traditional journalism.
Right.
I mean, that's partisan.
But they're mainstream. But they're mainstream media now, right?
But not mainstream journalism. There's a difference.
Right. But a large percentage of the people, although right now they're kind of in trouble because they've accepted the results of the election, so a lot of their followers are now looking for more extreme outlets that are still opposing the results. But Fox News certainly displays a bias, and people at the time believe that they are being objective.
Yeah.
And that in itself is problematic, but how do you explain that to somebody that,
Well,
you know?
well, I mean, because it seems to me what we have is a spectrum of objectivity, right?
Sure.
And I think that Fox News is much more objective than random things you're going to get on Twitter.
Okay,
right?
debatable.
Well, I mean, they at least, want to when they report things, want to put themselves in a position to be able to defend what they've said.
Right.
Right. There's no requirement to defend what you've said.
This is true.
yeah,
This is true.
yeah.
However,
On the web, yeah.
However, a recent lawsuit, I believe, against what was it Tucker Carlson that came up and and they Fox News executives actually said that you're not meant to take what they're saying literally. So therefore,
I remember Rush Limbaugh said that very early in his career, and then he stopped saying
and it's
it.
like,
yeah.
so it's open
Yeah.
for interpretation. So that allows them to,
Well, but what I'm saying is, I mean, isn't it really a spectrum here? Because they're making more of an effort than somebody with a blog has to make, right? And I in my mind, right, for whatever this is worth,
Sure.
right, I see the New York Times as being a little more objective than
Right.
Fox News is, and I think that the Washington Post is probably being a little more objective by traditional standards than the
Right.
New York Times is, because I think the New York Times has gotten pretty partisan in a lot of ways too, especially if you're following the election coverage. But so what do I do when I'm observing all this stuff? If I get it off of the internet and I don't know who it comes from,
Right.
it's something that might be true, might not be true. If I get it from Fox, it's something that might or might not be true, but they think they can defend it,
Right.
right, publicly. And if I get it from the New York Times, I'm going to trust it a little bit more. And if I get it from Washington Post, I might trust it a little bit more than that. But do I absolutely trust what I'm hearing? No, right?
Right. Yeah, and I would say you have to apply the same etiquette
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
procedure to social media and consuming social media, information from social media. And that's why, again, for me, even on social media, I try to find out where where it came from. So the sources are important, as well as who created it. Like, so in terms of the expertise that they have on that particular topic, whatever it is.
Well, it's sort of the difference between advertising and public relations. The advertiser writes an ad saying wonderful things about the company, and it gets printed as an ad. People understand that it's the company talking about themselves, and they take it with a grain of salt, right?
Right.
The public relations person writes a press release, which is essentially a news story, sends it to the newspaper. The newspaper looks it over and says, yeah, this is written in objective news style, and they publish it, and so it looks like it was written by an objective reporter. So the ad is a little bit less believable than the press release, even though they're both generated by the organization, because the press release has the guise of legitimacy because it went through a newspaper, and it seems to be written by a reporter, right?
Sure, yeah. So
so we're talking about those kinds of distinctions here, right?
And if we were to follow that and still believe in the institutions, that we have here in society, where they're certainly being questioned nowadays.
Well, of
again,
course, yeah.
Again, with the president calling everything that doesn't agree with him fake news, I mean, is highly problematic, right?
Yeah.
If we were to take that distinction, then we should still believe in these institutions, and you'd like to think that they're still trying to do what is best in terms of journalism and presenting facts as opposed to
Yeah, and they should, we shouldn't expect them to be right all the time, right? We just expecting them to, the ratio of correctness, right, is going to be stronger
for sure
here than it's going to be here, and there's no ratio at all maybe somewhere else, right? Now, if somebody posts something online and their credentials are there, right, and we understand that, then that can be just as legitimate as anything else.
Yeah.
The fact that it's online doesn't make it illegitimate.
No,
but there's no constraints.
Right, and what I'm seeing on social media is sort of this echo chamber that we've created in society, wherein, and confirmation bias, right? If the story aligns with your belief, regardless of who it comes from, then you're gonna, buy into it and it becomes more believable than a story that opposes your beliefs, regardless of who it comes from. And that's just standard on social media, right? And you know, and confirmation bias works for everyone because the way algorithms function, right? So, for example, just if I look up Tucker Carlson and I want to do some research on him, all of a sudden I'm bombarded with Sean Hannity stuff and all these other conservative pundits, right? And that's how the confirmation bias and echo chamber reinforces itself through social media.
So where are we at with the pandemic and social media right now? I mean, do you think it's played itself out? Or?
Well, I don't know because I would like to think because it's still increasing. So you would like to think that people would take it as something being serious. However, you hear these stories. So, for example, in Long Island, bars are refusing to close because. And they're being mandated to, and refusing to follow these the laws that are being put in place to try and save us from ourselves, essentially. So yeah, there will always, hopefully, it'll come to a head. But people will believe what they want, regardless. I would say. Is how it is nowadays.
Right. Well, there's always going to be that tendency, right?
Right.
We gravitate to things that we agree with.
But I think there's a lot less acknowledgement of education and of expertise. So, for example, on social media, on one of the boards that I belong to, sports message boards, somebody said, "Well, how does anybody know about COVID? There are no COVID experts because this is brand new." And it's like, how do you counter that? I mean, I can explain to him that there are people who've been studying this type of thing for, and this is their entire life's work, but he's going to discount them because, well, they're not COVID experts.
Yeah.
How can you be an expert on something that's never happened before?
Yeah. Well, one of the early, I'm going to wrap up in a second here, but one of the early rumors was that this came out of a lab in China.
Right. And that's still going around, yeah.
Yeah. And it comes up, and occasionally there are people who are credentialed who raise that as still as an issue.
Right.
How do you think that impacted this? Do you think that delegitimized the legitimate sources to some extent? Because if it comes out of a government activity and our government's doing it and their government's doing it, you can. It's not too hard to put together a picture where you've got governments not wanting people to know that this happened because they were messing around, right?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard.
There are some conspiracy theories that are more explanatory than others.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Because I mean, some people believe that it was created in China and it was part of the Democrats' nefarious plan in order to
undermine Trump.
To undermine Trump and how this happened and therefore him to lose his position of power.
Yeah.
I mean, and how do you counter that? I mean, what can you say to you could provide all the facts and all the evidence, but if somebody believes that, the chances of them listening to your facts and your evidence, regardless of how much you have, are slim to none.
Yeah. So what's the potential for creating some kind of structure through social media so that we can get expert sources that are attempting to be objective? Do you see that in the future at some point?
Well, okay, so one way to do that would be to vet everything that goes through, that flows through, and to do that.
And not everything on social media, but through certain channels, right?
Right, and to do that, you would be again curtailing the idea of freedom of speech. So,
but I mean, in other words, what if you created a Twitter news source that was following some paradigm of objectivity? Not forcing everybody else to do it, but this one claiming that it's doing it, right?
I think that
tried that?
Yeah, no, I think that would be, an amazing feat if it was done, and it certainly would have an audience. However, it would still have its detractors, regardless.
Yeah, well, of course, you're not going to get everybody on board. All right, well, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Terrell for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.